I made some notes. Again, I haven't really done anything like this, so I'm not the most, uh, you know, experienced. But I was going to go through a few things. I don't know how much everyone kind of knows, what everyone's kind of knowledge level is in this group. Sounds like a lot of people who work in the industry in various ways. But I thought I'd start with a little bit of Blender background, just real fast, because I feel like software, especially kind of getting to know how a software works and why it does the thing that it does, is very much kind of a product uh, of its like story, you know. Um, so Blender specifically is an open source piece of software, which a long time ago when I first started getting into 3D and other like artistic mediums and stuff, uh, open source software was always kind of like the butt of a joke. I feel like, right? It was kind of like, oh, it's always clunky, or it's always got some finicky thing, or it's always there's broken or whatever. And proprietary is always more stable and supported by studios. And whether it was teachers or colleagues or fellow students, someone always had something to say about open source. But I think that that's very much changed because we've noticed that software that is community focused, like even ZBrush, which I feel like ZBrush is proprietary, but ZBrush is a tool that is very community focused. They have like a big summit every year where they meet up with users and they get to know what users want, what users are interested in. And because they're working so close to their community, they end up getting constant feedback. They end up being more innovative. I feel like tools like ZBrush, tools like Blender, uh, especially when they have some funding backing, which Blender's gotten a lot more recently, having that direct connection to community leads to a lot of cool new features and artist-friendly tools. But I think that open source specifically has a little bit extra value. So Blender is under what's called the GPL license, or GNU Public License. It's basically a license that came out back in like the early 90s, I believe. And it was only existed because of like some old text editors and an old operating system created back at that time. And pretty much after it came into existence, GPL was used by Linux, and it still is. Linux is under the general public license. And the reason why they picked the GPL license back then, and I know that this might seem a little off topic, but I feel like this is somewhat important to like understanding a little bit of Blender's development cycle, is that code that was under GPL could be sold, it could be modified, it could be shared, it could be distributed however, but it would anything that you did with it, even if you sold it to someone, they could just give it away because it's always under GPL. It's always completely modifiable, shareable. You can do what you want with it, but at the end of the day, basically, you have to kind of give your modifications back to the community. And so in the case of Linux, what that led to was the largest collaborative project ever in the history of mankind. And that led to a ton of innovation. And some of the benefits, of course, of that was that it levels the playing field. So no matter where you are and who you are, you have access to tools that can do the job. You could live anywhere in the world and have any income. And as long as you have certain parts of an infrastructure, like a computer, whatever, you have access to tools that can do professional work. The other thing is that in the case of like Linux, one thing that the creator always said was that 1,000 eyes can fix any bug, which is very much true. You could have two really fantastic, amazing programmers, but that doesn't mean they can fix everything. But if you have like thousands of people from across the globe, with different backgrounds, different experiences, they're going to be able to solve things, and they're going to have different ideas of how tools should work. And that's why Blender is so weird too. It's the culmination of people from across Europe and up, and especially South America. There's people from all over the world contributing new tools, and they're all working on different parts of it at different times. And it leads to something that is, I think, really forward thinking, and always has been. But during its early stages, I felt like it was kind of clunky because not everything is artist friendly when it's made by a bunch of programmers. But why I think Um, sorry, I got a little messed up there. But essentially, open source has been around us forever, and then like even our file formats, OBJs and stuff, those are all open source. You know, most of ILM's innovations are, but it does mean too that Blender will always be free. It's owned by the community, so you'd literally need tens of thousands of people to agree for it to be like cost money. So it's something that I think is valuable to keep community driven. It's valuable to keep an eye on. And I think a lot of people don't know that about Blender, or they do, but they don't necessarily know as much about how segmented and how large that community is. So that was kind of my spiel there. But part of that is I don't know how many people know about the Blender Foundation or the Blender Institute. That is actually who develops Blender. It is community driven. There's people all over the world. I could submit code to it if I wanted to. I could be a developer. But most of the developers were gathered together by a guy named Ton Rosendahl, who created the software. And he created the Blender Institute, which is basically a place where artists and developers work together in the same building, and they develop Blender, at least key parts of Blender, and they make open movies. So movies that are funded by donations, and the files are downloadable. You can download set scene files, you can download assets, you can download rigs. And the way you can access this stuff is through the Blender website. You can go to the donate page, which leads you to here. You've got of course, it's going to take a sec. The Blender Development Fund, which is doing great. I remember when this made nothing. But this is, you got corporate grants, you've got individual grants. This is a place where if you are a Blender user and you care about Blender, you can make sure it has the development money that it needs. But you can also look at the Blender Cloud, which is also available through the main website. Blender Cloud is actually the way that they fund the Blender Institute, which is actually how they pay for the artists that live in-house. So they work in Amsterdam with the programmers, and they make this content. They make films, they make tutorials, they make assets, and they help make Blender what it is. So if you're learning Blender and if you want to learn Python and Blender, and you want to learn sculpting and grease pencil, this is a wonderful asset. And the money that you give to this goes directly to people who work on Blender every day. So that's kind of the general background. But I did want to talk about one more thing, and that's kind of some of Blender's development really fast. I'm just going to get through this so we can get to some actual Blender workflow stuff. But anyone who's using Blender now knows about 2.8. People who maybe are here that haven't been using Blender or just kind of hear about it, and they remember using Blender a while ago, and they remember it was very clunky, it was very weird, or they just didn't quite get it. Right-click select. Who the hell clicks with a right-click? But you can go to Blender. Blender 2.8 changed that. Left click is actually default now, but you can still switch back to right click. They've made it, again, they've tried to level the playing field. They've tried to open up the user base to people who use other programs, people who are new to 3D, to make it more accessible. And Blender also is on a 3-month cycle. So what that means is that every 3 months there's a new Blender version, which is actually too fast, and they've realized this. So they're actually going to start releasing a long-term support release, which is every year they're going to release one that will have bug fixes for 2 years and stuff like that. So it's a lot more corporate friendly. And so I think that Blender is definitely moving into a space that is where it really is going to take over a lot more of the industry. I legitimately believe that, especially among smaller studios. So when I talk to people and they say, "Oh, I don't want to learn Blender because it's not the industry standard," I think that is something that you shouldn't write it off, because it's also a generalist friendly tool that's going to help you get a lot of work done and do a lot of look dev really quickly, because it's not the same as like Maya. It's a little more focused, or a little less focused. It's a little more integrated within all its different parts. So anyways, that's the whole spiel on the background of Blender. But I feel like for anyone who doesn't know some of that stuff or is curious about more, I would highly recommend looking into it, because I feel like you'll learn a lot about why Blender is how it is as you go. So
that was a good spiel.
Thank you. Let me get a drink, actually. I talk a little fast.
We got a lot of new people joining. Hi, people.
Hello, folks.
This is a pretty cool stream thing here. I haven't used this in Discord yet. Do you know if there's a limit on how many people can get into the channel at one time?
I think
Oh, go ahead. Sorry.
the Discord. I think Discord has temporarily made it where you can have 50 for free.
Yeah, I think it's 10 normally, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a perfect time to do it.
Yeah.
All right. So let's jump into some actual Blender UI stuff. I do have some customized stuff here. This is not just default Blender, and it's not heavily. I work pretty close to bare metal, as I like to say, because it sounds cool. I don't have default items, but I actually don't. I wasn't planning on doing something that was necessarily like a follow along or anything. I just kind of wanted to dig into some just basic Blender UI and data structure for people who've never used it, and for people who maybe are coming from other workflows, 2D or whatever, or Maya. Like, I think that if you know other 3D programs, this will hopefully be something that maybe sheds some light on some stuff that I feel like is not always talked about. So this is Blender's UI. This is pretty much the general layout. I just deleted the default stuff. And I have a couple, oh, actually, you know what? I have a screencast keys right there. Look at that. Got some stuff in the corner. You'll notice that I'm using Alt, and I'm using a pen tablet, so I'm not using an actual mouse. So if you see a bunch of stuff, you're like, if you're a Blender user and you're confused how I'm navigating, I'm on a pen tablet. So Blender's UI is organized into a few different things. It's organized into what are called windows, and those windows, you'll kind of see them kind of pop with color as I go over them, like these bars. These are all windows, and Blender is pretty much just always made up of windows, and you can make new ones just dragging out from a corner between two of them. And every window has this little like button in the corner. And what that is that's basically you can change what that window is. You can say, oh, this is a graph editor. It's a giant graph editor. And oh, this is a Python console because I'm crazy and I use Python console. And you can get rid of them and stuff. But essentially, that's how Blender's kind of always laid out, just a series of windows. And hotkeys, if you use any hotkeys, if you just have your mouse sitting here and you start trying to use hotkeys for the 3D view, that little bar of light that happens is saying where those hotkeys are happening. So if I came here and I started doing stuff, it's not going to affect my 3D view because that's not highlighted with my mouse cursor. So Blender then organizes those windows with what are called workspaces, which are up here at the top. And these are actually something they've always had, but I love the way they've kind of laid these out in 2.8. So you've got, you got layout, which is the default one. It's pretty much always what Blenders look like. Just a little cleaner looking nowadays. Modeling, which is just all it is layout without the timeline. Sculpting, which is just the modeling one without grid lines, because you can, right here, there's like overlays and this little button, and you can turn on and off what you want and whatnot. And so they're just like slightly customized versions of each other. This goes on and on and on. This one takes a sec to load on my laptop. Shading, come on, which is just like a node editor and a 3D viewport that's just got settings on for stuff and animation, etc. And then there's also templates. So there's also, if you go to File New, they've added these templates, which are great. There's one for 2D animation, and there's one for like sculpting, and it's great. They're just basically different default Blender startup files, which is kind of how you organize your Blender custom stuff. But that's pretty much like the general UI layout of Blender as it relates to just like usability. But some of the rest of it, like for example, this properties panel here, this is laid out actually very much according to how Blender stores data. So I'm going to jump kind of into that really fast. So you'll notice up here in the corner, this is our little outliner, and I'm going to kind of be using this to explain a few things. Whoops, 1 second. Something happened. Sorry, I got caught up in something. So I'm going to go ahead and just add Suzanne, or a monkey, but it's Suzanne. She's the Blender mascot. Just like teapots are always those, default 3D models. This is Blender's teapot. So this is Suzanne. And you'll notice that in the outliner up here, this collection doesn't matter. You can ignore that. Basically, that's just a way of organizing stuff within a scene. But Suzanne is an object. And the reason that the way that Blender organizes things is they starts with object data, or object data blocks is what they call them. And so anything that's an orange thing here is an object. And that's actually why there's up here in the corner, there's this little modal switcher. You can also use tab. I have a little pie menu set up. I won't go into how to set that up, but it's a way to switch between these modes and stuff. But there's object mode, which is kind of the main one here. And you'll see that everything I select is like in an orange outline. If I deselect it and select it. Also, that screencast keys, did that turn off? Seems like it's not working. Am I right? That's weird. It just stopped working.
I think we're seeing the keys that you're pushing now.
Oh, yeah, it was weird. It stopped working, and then I toggled it, and it's working again. It's strange. So Suzanne is an object. And to kind of demonstrate this a little further, you also notice that there's inside of that object, this twirl down, there's this little green thing. And that green thing is actually a data block. Now, it's actually a mesh data block, but it's something that's housed within this object. So this object is a mesh object because it contains a mesh. And basically, you'll notice down here on this properties panel, everything that's an object, everything that exists, whether it's, let's say, light. Let's grab a light real fast. Or if you have camera, all of these things are objects. They're all an orange icon up here. And each one of them has inside of it some data block type. So this camera, the only reason there's even a camera icon here is because it's stored with this camera data. And so essentially, these are all objects, and all of them have this little tab here that's orange. That's a square, and that square, that basically means it's the object panel, object properties. So if I select Suzanne or any of these, they've got this orange box, and that orange box pretty much has the same data. It doesn't have different tabs because these are different things. And pretty much the information that's in here are like some relationships and whatnot, but the biggest things that an object contain is that they have location, rotation, and scale. So the way I imagine an object is like a room, and that room is a certain size. It's facing a certain way, cardinally, and it's located in a specific spot. So if I move her or whatever, that data changes. Now this green tab down here, there's a bunch of blue ones. We'll get to those in a minute, but this green one here, you'll notice this is an edit. It matches the one that's up here. It was the same with the light and the camera. They had, and this is specific stuff that it revolves around meshes, and those that data. You'll also notice that there's a different thing here. This says Suzanne, and this says Suzanne, but they have different icons. So I'm going to rename this. I'm going to actually rename this to just like Bob. And you'll notice up here in the outliner, we've got an object called Suzanne, and this mesh data called Bob. And if I select Bob, Suzanne all of a sudden is a bunch of points. She's actually switched us over here from object mode to edit mode. And that's because we're no longer editing the object, Suzanne. We're editing the mesh, the Suzanne, which is the room storing, which is a mesh called Bob. And to demonstrate how this is kind of how this data is kind of held in Blender, because you can actually see that if you click on these little menus show you everything of that data block in the scene. So I'm going to create a cube. Just create a cube, put that over here. And this cube is called cube, and it's got a cube in it called cube. We're going to change that cube to, like, I don't know, Trey. Who knows? It sounds like Bob and Trey. They're good names. So cube contains a cube-shaped mesh called Trey, and Suzanne contains a monkey-shaped thing called Bob, but there's still separate objects called Cube and Suzanne. Now I can actually go to Cube and I can go to this mesh data block tab. And in there, I have that little menu, and I can drop that menu down. And you'll notice I actually have Bob and Trey in here. I can select Bob. And now I have a cube with a Bob and a Suzanne with a Bob. And that is pretty much how an instance works in Blender and as well as any other program. So if we go into edit mode, I'm actually editing Suzanne, or Bob, sorry. I'm editing Bob on both Suzanne and Cube at the same time. And that's because they're the same mesh data, but they're different objects. And so I'll show why that kind of matters. So I can actually do things to this Suzanne object and Bob, which is this other. But notice that I'm not actually modifying the monkey mesh data. I'm modifying this object's spatial size and rotation, and I can even set this back to Trey, the cube, and it just goes on and on and on. And so that's pretty much like if I duplicate Suzanne, I'll actually get oh god, that's cube. Actually, that's getting confusing. So this is cube and this is cube.01, and it actually contains a new Bob, which has its own mesh data, which is different from the other Bob, etc. And I was losing my train of thought here. Gosh, oh yes. So, man, I was like thinking more about this. I got mixed up. Oh yes, that's what I was going to go into. Fake users. So you'll notice if I switch this mesh to be using Trey again, and this one to also be using Trey, in this mesh dropdown, both those Bobs have a 0 next to them. And what that 0 means is that they actually don't have users. So that means that I actually now have 3 objects, and they're all containing the same mesh. That is, again, it's the same exact one for all of them. But this object, of course, has a lot of different properties in its object panel than these ones do. But those ones, those other mesh data blocks now don't have users. And what that actually means, Blender stores all data blocks constantly in the background up here. You can switch this from view layer to different hierarchies, but we're just going to look at orphan data. What that is that's a list of things that are in the Blender scene which don't have users. You'll notice there's our light we deleted earlier, there's our Bobs, there's our camera we deleted earlier, and Blender will actually purge this data when you close the file. It'll actually say, all right, you know what, you don't want this stuff. You didn't give it a user. No one's using it. And it's doing garbage collection for you. And if you don't want that, let's say you really want to send a model to a client, and you want that client to, you have like 5 hammer designs in this guy's hand, and you really want to get feedback on these 5 hammers. You could have like 5 hammer objects in the scene that are all in various places or hidden or whatever. You could also just have 5 hammer like mesh data blocks and just keep them. And what you can do, you go to this edit thing and you go to this drop down, I can go to one of these Bobs and I can give it, this is a little shield here. If I click that, it's what's called a fake user. So what that does, if I see this drop down again, I'll switch this back to Trey. You'll see that no longer has a 0 next to it. It actually has an F next to it. And that's because it has a fake user. Blender will actually see that as a binary of not 0. And it'll be like, okay, I'm not purging that. It's no longer on the orphan data list, and it is treated as something that you can constantly go back to. So, because one thing that I ran into a lot when I was first starting using Blender was I would have a bunch of materials. And I'm like, I'm gonna make a template file with a bunch of materials for this client thing I'm working on. And all of a sudden, I reopen the file, and all these materials I wasn't using but wanted to keep just in case were missing. And that's because Blender deleted them. And that's because they didn't have any users. And that's actually how presets are stored for brushes, for all kinds of different things. Blender requires a fake user, which that will change. There's an asset library coming, which will kind of basically do that automatically. But that's like a big way of, even outside of Blender, like other 3D programs kind of handle data collection this way. It's just not always so in your face. But it does directly correspond to this little tree and why this is important. So those blue icons, this is the modifiers, particle systems, physics, and constraints. Those are things that can coexist with mesh data. So like if I go to this one and I select modifiers and I give this a bevel modifier, this has a bevel on it now, which is great. These ones don't, and they're the same mesh data. They're the same everything. They're different objects and they don't have this modifier data block, which you'll notice is living side by side with that mesh data. So Blender basically is telling you that here's an object. This object is a mesh data type, and that mesh data type can contain these types of modifiers or effects, and then mesh data can be given children as well. For example, you can give it materials. Materials can be given to meshes. Whoops, why did that freeze up on me? So you'll notice that material is now inside of tray, and it's not. It's actually given to all these trays. Look, every trays now has a material on it. And that's because a material, which is below this data block, is actually a child of the mesh data block itself. And then, of course, there's textures, which are children of materials, and it goes on and on. But that is a constantly going thing. And so if you're ever in Blender and you're like, oh, I need to do something, or I can't figure out why I can't use certain constraints on cameras that I can on meshes, that's related to the fact that cameras are not coded to take modifiers, and that's not just because it's coded that way, but it's still like organized in a similar way. It just doesn't have those certain relationships. So this is really an interesting way. You can even keep multiple camera settings. For example, that one that we deleted earlier still exists with no users. And if this was a 75 millimeter and this was a 50 millimeter, you don't have to animate. You don't always have to animate like a lens animation. You could also animate a data block switch, or you can have different camera presets within a file that you always use. So that's like a pretty interesting way of kind of handling, like dealing with like Blender's like data structure. And so if you ever run into a problem, for example, let's say you'll notice bevel. It's not as obvious here. Maybe I'll flush everything. Start over. If I make a cube, and let's just scale it like crazy, and I put a bevel modifier on it. You notice this bevel modifier looks really stupid. It's like stretched, and it looks all dumb. And that's because that bevel modifier is a modifier to the mesh inside this object. It's not directly. It's modified by these values, which is the object's values. So transform, rotation, scale. So that bevel is actually being affected by the fact that this is at 4 times its normal X scale. And in Blender, whenever you run into problems where you're like, why is this thing acting weird, or why is my sculpting tool like jutting off into space? That's because you want to make sure that these are one by one, just like a 1 by 1 by 1 scale. You want to make sure it's uniform. And so if you just go to Control A, or you can actually go up to Object, Apply here. You can also search in Blender with F3 at any time. Blender has gosh, that screen keys. What is going on with you? That's weird. So if you hit the F3 key, you can always search in Blender for anything that you need. So you can look up Apply, whatever you want. But we're going to apply the scale of this object. And that's what that's saying, is that's telling this this object that you should be 1 by 1 by 1, and you should modify the thing within you to 1 by 1 by 1, or basically to match what its current deformation is. So if I actually created a new cube, this is cube.001. This is let's go to the mesh data block. Actually, we've got cube and we've got cube.001, right? If I give this that first cube that's being used here, that's actually modified. That's been baked into the mesh data block within it because I applied that scale. I was saying I want that to actually be what's on the mesh within it. And so you'll notice that bevel looks much better right off the bat. And why this is important, why this difference of mesh to object is important, is actually a big thing that I run into with ZBrush all the time. When you work in ZBrush, ZBrush is actually not designed as a full 3D program. It's designed as like a painting program that has 3D tools in it. It's really weird, but nothing has a local node is what I'll call it, but like basically local data. So if I rotate this cube in object mode, right? Whoops. If I rotate, what did I do, Cory? If I rotate this thing in object mode, I actually have this data here. I can go crazy. I can get nuts with it. And it's fine. It's like I can actually even undo that. You can go to object, clear, rotation. So I'm gonna it's Alt R. Alt R. We zeroed out our rotation. That's great. I can do whatever I want. I can always go back to where I want to be. If I go into edit mode and I want to, or let's not go there yet. If I want to move this thing, like I have, I'll talk about some of these tools in a minute. But I just have my global tools, but up here at the top, you've got the transformation orientation. It says global. That's following the global axes. Change it to local, and I actually have all this baked in data. I have this basically modifying this transformation orientation to match these values, and I have all that data stored there. And if I did the same thing with a cube, and I instead did the same, rotated it around all gross in edit mode, right? I was in edit mode here, so I'm editing the mesh instead of the object. Notice my local didn't change, and that's because I did it on a object, a mesh level instead of an object level. And I don't have any data. I have nothing here. This one, I have all this information. And that's like super important because there's other ways to get around this. Like you could go, there's actually a thing called normal up here. And if you go into edit mode, you go to face mode, which is here, there's verts, edges, and faces, which you can hit 1, 2, and 3. You can select a face and you can actually, it'll give you the normal of your selection, which is great, but it's not always accurate. Like rotation of this gives me what you want. It's not going to give you like the perfect effect. So there's a lot that you can utilize between what you do in object mode and what you do in edit mode, because those things are also related to, where's this origin at? Which that origin is pretty much the origin of the room. So I'm going to portray this. I think everyone gets it and everything, but and probably also mostly review. But I think it's kind of useful to see this way. So basically, the way I always like to think about it, that this is like a room. Inside that room is your mesh. Imagine that this is just a mesh. And if I, grab this thing and I rotate this room around, I'm editing that mesh, but this is separate, and this is a separate thing that oh gosh, what am I doing, Cory? It's a separate thing that I'm editing inside this, and it's not until I basically tell this room like, hey, set yourself back to 1 by 1 by 1. Make this the mesh's definition, that it's gonna bake that into this, because this thing is technically untouched deep inside the data storage, essentially. So that's like a really useful thing to think about, especially if you want to use the same mesh or use arrays. Essentially the difference between duplicating something, like if I do that, I have these are new versions versus a link, what's doing called duplicate linked or instancing something, so other hotkey. And you'll notice that is the same dash as the one I just did. It's basically that hotkey difference where I just did Shift D for duplicate and Alt D for instance. All that did was this made a new mesh data block that was a copy of this one. And this one made a new object.
Did you want anyone to ask questions or anything?
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was going to have Q&A like whenever, but also if I meant to mention this, if I ever go on and on, or if there's something that I move past or mention that someone specifically is interested in, please mention it, and I will talk about it.
Yeah, I had a question actually.
Yeah.
So you talk about data that's baked.
Mhm.
I'm currently working a lot in Blender and wondering, there's, I don't know if we should go this far, but like there's Eevee and Cycles render engines, and if you want to do exportable data that's friendly for like Unity or Unreal, like game engines, when you talk about baked data, that's not the same as like baking data through Cycles, right?
No, yeah, not necessarily the same. I mean, it's kind of similar because it's similar because you're doing it on a level of saying that, hey, the deformations I did to this object, I want to apply and bake to the mesh. It's kind of similar that you're saying, hey, the render settings and the render that I have, light bounces, I want that, what's hitting that mesh to be baked to pixels or whatever, to be, or it's a similar thing, but it's a little different because it's kind of it's still, it's not necessarily part of Blender's data structure. It's just kind of like a calculation to create an image map. So it's similar, but I think it's a little bit different. Yeah, I hope this is not just too much review for a bunch of people. I hope this is interesting. Because Maya works similarly. It's a node system, so it's got an object node or a locator, which is basically a location, rotation, and scale. And then after that, it has a mesh, like point cloud, edges and stuff, which is what we're dealing with here. So I'm going to move on a little bit here to a few other things. Oh, and actually, you know what? Before I leave, because I think it's important to go into the same thing happens with like a grease pencil object. A grease pencil object is, you know what? We'll make a monkey again. A grease pencil object is the same thing. It's just an object with its own stuff, and then inside of it you have basically point data for 2D points in space, and those have like a width value and stuff, just like a mesh would have like normal value for like which way a polygon is facing, etc. So it's all the same stuff, and it relates to everything always the same way. I don't know what that sound is. So let's talk about some other workflow stuff in Blender really fast, and we can get into maybe a little more in-depth QA that's not related to any of this stuff you guys don't want it to be. So the first thing I want to talk about in Blender is workflows and just the general workflow. For those who don't use Blender, it's pretty easy to navigate. It's usually middle mouse to rotate, scroll to zoom. In my case, it's a pen tablet, so I'm using different stuff, and middle mouse plus shift to pan. And that's like the general way to move around the viewport. But on a working with objects or mesh level, there's kind of like a workflow in Blender that's a little different from other programs. There are, especially now with 2.8, like a lot of really great gizmos. You've got your scale, you rotate, you move. You got this other one that's like all in one if you're crazy and you like that. But to be honest, I don't use them. I don't really use gizmos. And the reason why is I've always hated accurate clicking. I think that especially working as an artist, all I want to do is make creative decisions. And I don't want to necessarily be accurate with like starting an action. I just want to like nudge stuff around. I want to move things. I want to get in there. I want to get my hands dirty. Like I don't sit here and I don't just sit here and move stuff on like global axes and local axes all day long. I think that that gets old. That's not artistic. I mean, it is, but you know what I mean. It's not like my brain doesn't want to think that it's artistic. I move stuff from view all the time, and in Blender, the three main gizmos that everyone's used to: move, rotate, and scale. Blender calls them grab, rotate, and scale. And those hotkeys are G for grab, R for rotate, and S for scale. And it's you just tap it. And what I love is that it's also related to where your mouse is. There's like that little orange dot in the center of this cube, which is the object origin, not the mesh origin, but the object. Mesh doesn't have one; it just uses the data from the object. And it's directly related to how close you are to that. So if I do rotation, I'm really close to it, so it's really fast. If I'm out here, it's really slow because I got big arcs. So I can kind of like where my mouse is in relation to when I hit that key is very much this like, because if I'm sculpting or if I'm modeling really fast, I'm making like little decisions from, I'll look at something from an angle, nudge it over, whatever. You can also left click does the thing, and right click cancels the last part of the function. And that's great, but then you might wonder, well, you got to eventually use the X, Y, Z eventually. And you can, because you can modify any of these hotkeys with any axis. So you just hit G, and then you hit any axis. You can hit X, Y. You just hit Y. You don't have to hit G at Y. Hit G, X. You can change your mind. Hit Z, Y, whatever. You can even do something crazy, which is you can hit G, and you can shift click whatever one you don't want. So I can say Shift Z, and I'm actually not moving this cube up and down. I'm just moving it further away and closer, which is really cool. You can even rotate stuff the same way. Rotate on the Z, rotate on the X, rotate on the Y, rotate on the Shift X. You can even do the same thing with scale. You can just scale on not the Z axis or just the Z axis. What did I do? Cory, you crashed it. You did it. No, I just went to render view. So that's like pretty much how I work all. And just like having this menu up here, if you actually double tap the same key, so I'm going to rotate this guy so it's gross and in a weird orientation. I did this in object mode, so I have data to work with over here. I can actually, instead of changing this menu and going G-local, which as soon as that's set to that, it'll do that first. I can actually leave it in global. If I want to do local, I can just hit X twice. I can just hit G, X, X, and R, Z, Z. And you can just, this stuff works forever. And it even works in edit mode. As long as the object has the data, I can take this face and I can move it on the Z or the local Z or the local X, etc. Or I can change this to normal, and I can do the normal, whatever. You have all the same functionality, and you never have to accurately click anything. You don't even have to click on just the red arrow or click on just the tiny, skinny little rotation red line. You can just rotate on X. And what I like about this is that I could basically stick my, work on just left-hand hotkey. So, like for example, one of the most other common hotkeys in Blender is E for extrude. And so, like forever, there was no taper tool in Blender, and everyone was, why isn't there a taper? Because you just do S and then right-click to cancel. Or sorry, E and then right-click, which doesn't cancel the extrusion; it cancels the move, and then you just scale it. And that was like how you did tapers, not tapers. You know what I mean. This thing inset, Cory. And that's like how I did stuff forever. And it's like I never have to do anything fancy. If I want to rotate this monkey onto its face or whatever, or just rotate it 45 degrees on the Z axis, I just hit R, Z, 45, enter. That's it. You just need to type in some values. And that's really handy because I constantly find myself just wanting to just do something really fast. I don't, and in my Max, for so long when I was learning 3ds Max, I would struggle with the fact that I would have to constantly open menus and then click on the X field and type a value and hit OK, and it would do the thing. Like, I just want to keep moving. I just want to make sure. I just want to see if this looks good. So just want to nudge it a little bit from view. I mean, that looks great. So that's like the biggest thing in Blender is like if you get yourself used to just general hotkeys, because you'll just move around very quickly, and I feel like the software becomes so much less of a barrier. It wasn't until I started using Blender. I mean, ZBrush is great, but I feel like having the data here, having modifiers, having actual modeling tools alongside sculpting tools, I'm able to do a lot more stuff. So that local data is interesting too, because if I go into sculpt mode here, and I turn on, if I have X symmetry on, you'll notice I actually I'm actually using X symmetry that works perfectly on an object that is definitely not symmetrical in world space, but it is related to its object because it's got rotation value. And of course, if I did that with an object, edited the mesh instead of the object, I wouldn't have that. I would have to. It would be jumping across the line. I'll just show you. So if I went this, and then I start sculpting, you'll notice I got points over this little point over here on the side, because it doesn't know. It doesn't know where I should be looking, where it should be looking for that spot. So I think that's like a super important part of Blender. And I'll also mention this cursor for those who are constantly frustrated with it. A couple other things. Blender has a really unique way of handling. Oh, we got a question really fast. How do you get the symmetry to work again? How to resymmetrize the mesh? That's actually a good question. That's hard to do. If it gets all rotated, there's a few things you could force it, right? You could, if you have a cube that's let's take a cube. I mean, it's a cube, not a face or something. But you have this thing here, and you want to resymmetrize it. You can get the origin back over, but getting the rotation correct is very difficult. The best thing you can probably do is add like a mirror modifier, and then just jam it around till it's good. That's one way to do it, because there was a question in the chat. I don't know if everyone saw it, but basically how to resymmetrize it if you didn't do stuff in object mode. So this is really gross, but this is definitely one way to do it, because you can get I'll show you how to get the back to the center of a spot that you want. But that's if you start doing too much stuff in edit mode. If I'm sculpting a face and I just have it out of pose, I would have to force a new origin center and just make it work. There's also other tools. In sculpt mode specifically now. I love the sculpt mode now. There's like a dyne topo symmetrized. There's a remesh thing, and there's also this. It's actually not in this. Oh, because I've been working on the alpha because I'm an insane person. There is this dyne topo symmetrize, which actually no, I think that's the same thing. It's now in this menu and in the alpha. So basically, you could just move this mesh around. Oh God, see, I think it's trying to do X mirror and then symmetrize it, and that will work too. But I think basically you're just going to have to brute force it at that point. When I get to the 3D cursor, I'll mention how to realign a origin to the center of a specific spot on a model that's lost where its origin is. All right, let me look at what I was going to mention. All right, another thing that's super important in Blender, there's two very unique sets of selection types. So there's actually what's called active selection and just selection, which is kind of a sub-level of selection. So that sounds a little nuts, but I'll show you kind of what I mean. If I select two objects, you'll actually notice that even up in the outliner in here, it's a darker orange line, it's darker orange text. One is brighter. And it actually even is the same in edit mode. Like if I select two faces, this one actually has a white outline and it's slightly brighter. Same with edges. One of them is white, the other two are orange. And this is super important because so much of Blender kind of wants data from somewhere, right? And it can only have one candidate, or it can have an average of multiple candidates. So in the case of, say, having two objects selected, if my pivot, which is up here, we didn't talk about this before, but right here in the middle, there's this pivot point menu, which you can access with the period key. If your pivot set a median point, it's the average of bounding boxes that you have selected. So taking into account the mesh data within everything that you have selected, and using the central bounding box of those points. Actually, I think by default in object mode, the average of all object origins in the scene. So you'll notice I'm rotating around the center of the. If I use something like individual origins, it's using. Oh, and yes, you can ask questions via the chat or vocally too, if it's something that you just want to mention.
In case anyone doesn't know where the chat is, it's #Blender.
Yeah, good point, because this is, I forgot this is the general chat. So you've got this individual origins, which is of course, using each one of these object origins separately, which again, if I edit one of these things in edit mode and not in object mode, you'll notice there's like this little orange dot that didn't move with the cube because I didn't move the object. If I do the same thing, it's rotating around where its object center is, which is good to know. So you don't, if you don't want that. Let's see, wondering what the difference is between array modifiers and instant. That's a good question. I'll get to that in just a second. This is cool because there's also other options like 3D cursor, in a minute, and there's this active element. Active element is really cool because now this is the active object. It's going to use its data exclusively for anything that you do.
Not so quick.
As
the other guy, I'm saying, as the man. Sorry if it smells like
Not sure why that happened. Sorry.
No, it's all good. Anyways, the reason that this is important is in the case of, for example, we talked about earlier, we had that object kilter, and I wanted to be able, I didn't have local to be able to manipulate it the way that I wanted it. But I know that I basically wanted that cube to go up based off of this face. This face is the only thing on this object pointing in the direction I want to move this thing. So I can use that to my advantage. I can select this whole object, and I can, if you hold Shift and add to your selection,
sort of Lego Master.
You can select a face. Basically, the last thing that you select will become active. You just Shift select something a couple times and just deselect and select it. It'll become the bright active one. So if I change this menu to normal, it's not going to be. I'm just going to rotate this more obvious. But of course I set that 3D cursor. I can actually use the Z coordinates. I can actually use the coordinates from this face because it's active. It's using the active one, even though I have a whole selection of faces using just that one. So that's a really useful way to take advantage of that active versus selected type of thing. It's also important too, because let's say you want to do a batch of things. For example, this object has a bevel modifier, and you want that bevel modifier. You have all these settings that you changed, and we're adding one segment, and I don't want to do that, to like 9 different cubes. I don't want to just do that all day long. So I can actually select a bunch of things, and you'll notice if I select this last, these are all dark orange. This is bright orange. So this is active. There's actually a thing in Blender called linking, and you can do that from the object menu or F3, and you can search. But you can also use Control L to make links. And what I want to do is I actually want to say, hey, take the active object, it's always active, and take its modifiers and give its modifier to everything that's selected, not active. And it'll actually put that on only the things that are, like nothing that's deselected, but all the things that are selected that not active. So it's a very useful way of putting like the same material on like 20 different things, because it's going to drive you insane if you have to 20 times. And because again, you're just taking the data block that exists on that object, and you're saying, hey, every bit of data that's called this, go to all the other things. You're going to share that. You're going to copy it around. Oops, sorry. What am I doing? All right. Let's see. Dan, you mentioned can you use box select on 20 objects? One shift. I actually don't necessarily what you mean by that question. However, I will talk about your array modifiers. An array modifier is essentially creating a bunch of instances, but they only exist due to the modifier until you apply it, which then it actually bakes it into the mesh permanently. Yeah, but let's see. Can you use box select on 20 objects, then shift click the parent? Oh, yes. So now I think I get what you mean. So if you do a box select, so let's just make something over here. If you did a box select to a bunch of stuff, let's just do everything. And you shift select any of these, you'll notice that it keeps changing what's active, even up in this outline. And you can actually parent everything to that active. So now that's the parent of all those objects. You can do all kinds of stuff with it. So basically, it's active is always kind of like the thing that's getting all the. It's not like all this data is getting put on. This actives data is being. So, let's see. And then what was that? So I got to talk about. Talked about local versus global. Let's talk about 3D cursor.
Oh, sorry. Were you gonna talk about that array thing?
Oh, I thought I did, but I'll mention it again. So if I add an array modifier, of course. Oh my God, I slided it too far. And I have like these 4 things created by an array. These are all essentially instances of the mesh inside, but what it'll do, I guess I'm curious what your question is. It says, wondering the differences between array modifiers and instances. So this is basically creating a bunch of instances along rules you set, right? Like having an empty that you're using as a rotation point, which you can do in here and stuff. You can use like another object as a rotation point. So it's just, it can be anything. It can be an empty object. We'll just use a cube. And you could say object offset, blah, blah, blah. It just uses this object data. So whether this is an empty, whether it has a mesh in it, it's just using this object's data, the stuff in that orange panel, to modify each one of these. So this is given the same data that this one has, and then it does it to the next one, does it to the next one forever. And so it's like basically an instance that's on a set of rules. However, it's really difficult to take this and say, okay, cool. Now I want this as an instance version of this with these rotations. It'll instead, as soon as you hit apply, it'll actually bake it to the mesh, and it's actually now a permanent part of that mesh. What's it called? Cube.23. We've made so many cubes. I made cube.23. So yeah, so you can actually see it's actually baked to the mesh. It doesn't actually create each one of these as an individual, and that's actually where you'd want to do something like let's say use an empty parent. There's a few different ways you could do it, but essentially you'd want to you'd have to do it a little differently if you wanted each of these to be an individual object that's an instance, each with an origin in the center.
Could you do set on individual origins from the menu next to where it says normal? Like use individual origins on instances?
You can't. If you sorry, actually that's a good question. I'm trying to see what you mean, but
because like essentially, sorry, I'm trying to reverse engineer how it would be possible to create like a procedurally generated scene using like arrays and then using like instances, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So there's a few ways to do that. Like you could use particle systems. Honestly, I think particle systems are like ways to scatter shit all over the place. Excuse my language. So like if you want to scatter a bunch of buildings all over a grid, particle systems usually are the best way because they are individual particles that are then objects. But this, for example, if I went in here and I actually started, if I rotate this, all it's doing is rotating the starting point of the first cube. It's still getting affected by it, even if I have individual origins on, because I only have one origin. It's this one. None of these have origins. However, if you bake this to a mesh, now these are all mesh. Individual origins will work, and the only reason is because individual origins in mesh mode is is directly related to bounding boxes of points, so of elements. So an element is like if I hover over anything and I actually hit the L key, or basically it's like an entire island of verts that are disconnected from other things. So if I select like everything in here, and I basically the individual origins is calculated off of an element's point cloud bounding center, essentially. So you could do it this way, and if you wanted, you could split all these out. You can even do split by loose parts. And, each of these will be individual objects, but notice they all have this origin in the center here, and you'd have to go in and change the origin by hand, which I'll actually show here when I 3D cursor. But does that kind of cover a little bit of?
Yeah, that makes a little more sense. And then like, yeah, you're probably gonna talk about it in a second because you mentioned it. But like the individual origins and then setting origins for each baked mesh, like how you would go about doing that if you wanted to like.
I'll mention that here with the 3D cursor. This is like kind of the last thing I think I was going to mention later, and I still want people to be able to ask questions. So, because we can talk about anything. I don't know everyone's skill level. So, anyways, this little thing. I'm a right-click user because I've been using Blender for like 10 years. Okay. Thanks. Forgot to turn the lamps on, so I'm in the dark. For people who are right-click users, thing has always been like they're like, I'm going to select this cube, and they'll click, and then they're like, I didn't. I just moved this stupid thing that I don't know what it does. Now that Blender has left-click default, this isn't a problem for a lot of new users, I think, but it's always been an incredibly useful tool, and for the longest time, it was the only way that you could actually modify origin. There was no way to like nowadays cube. And I'm going to move the cursor over. You can see, but there's like this little origin there. If I go up to this options menu, top corner, if you don't have it, you can actually right click on the bar that has your window changer. And there's this thing called show tool settings. That'll bring up basically a new toolbar that has specific stuff to the tool that you've selected. And it also has this options menu, which is really cool. That's definitely changed a lot. So anyways, there's this origins, locations, and parents. And if you check this origins, you'll notice that now there's actually like an empty, like a locator at where that origin is. And if I use my hotkeys, my G key or my R key or whatever, I'm actually moving that little orange dot around. And I'm moving it. I can snap it to stuff. I use the snapping tools, which maybe I'll talk about more in a minute. Like I won't mention it. There's this little magnet here. If that turns on auto snapping, you can also leave that off and just set this to what you want, like verts, and just hold Control. So if I G, Z, and if I do that, see it's like snapping to the vert when I hold Control. What's cool is it also obeys your locks. If I hit G, Z, and when I hit the vert, it only moves on the Z, and then it lines up with the vert, which is cool. So that's how you like quickly snap. But anyways, you could say I want this orientation to be at the top of this. You can turn that off. There you go. I've edited the origin. My rotate point in object mode is here. Oops, rotate mode object is there, and edit mode is the bounding box, origin mode, etc. But back in the day, you didn't have that option. So instead, I keep deleting monster. Whoa, what happened? So that 3D cursor is interesting because I don't know how many people have played like Warcraft or StarCraft or any like old like RTSs. But when you have a building and you create a new unit at that building, like a peasant or a warrior or whatever, you'd be like, I'm gonna create them. They would get created around the building constantly. But you could also, there's like a little flag that you could move around. And wherever that flag was, whenever you made someone, they would just walk across the entire map even to go to wherever that flag was. It was basically a rally point. And I always thought of that as like Blender's rally point. If I move that cursor wherever I want, I can create stuff, and it always makes it with the origin at the end. And that may seem kind of dumb because it doesn't seem very accurate. It seems like I'm just clicking, and I can kind of click at the center, but who's to say? Oh, whoopsie! It's only the center from that view. So who's to say that I'm even accurate with this thing? And that's actually where Blender's snap menu has always been super, which is Shift S. You can also find it in, I believe, Object Snap. You can search with F3 as well. But if you just hit Shift S, which I think is one of the most used hotkeys in Blender, is nowadays you got a pie menu. Back in the day, it's just a list. But you've got like this cursor to world origin. And all that does is that just snaps that thing exactly to the world. Always, no matter what's happening, no matter how your scene's laid out, you can always snap that thing out to world origin. But you've also got a ton of other options. And there's actually a difference. There's like a little icon. This little icon means selection, and this one means cursor. Yes, yeah, exactly. You're talking about setting an origin. And that's pretty much what we're going to do. We're going to actually use this to set origins, and I think why it's also a really useful tool for that. So, for example, let's make a cube again, because cubes are great. If I want to make a cylinder at this exact face right here, I'm gonna turn that dang gizmo off because I don't like them gizmo. If I want to make a cylinder right here, right at this face, a monkey, let's do a monkey. I can actually go to that snap menu. And I can say cursor to selected. You'll notice that it goes to the exact center of that. It's the same with verts. If I select 2 verts or an edge, 3 verts, or whatever, it will always do cursor to selected, which in that case didn't change. It'll always be the exact average of whatever your selection of points. Same thing with objects. If you have 2 objects, it takes into account that object origin, snap this to the selected, which will always be the center of origin of object. But what's cool is, let's say for me, if I'm working on, and I am like, oh, this model has like a little base that it's on, and I need to like rotate. I need to do a turntable render client or whatever, and I need to make it empty at the exact center of the object, or I need to put it at world 0, blah blah blah. And it's this gross geometry. It's not like it's a kind of a ring of triangles. And all I know is I have a perfect circle of verts. That's all I know. It's not very good looking. I can select those verts, just select right through, and I can just say, cursor to selected. I can say, okay, cool. That's the floor. I want to put that at world origin. I first have to move my origin to where that cursor is, so that object origin is the topmost part of this. And that's as easy as you can search for it. You can set a hotkey for it. There's a lot of ways to do it. What did I do? I hit caps lock. Set origin. I move a little fast, kind of break stuff. But if we, you also go to object, set origin, and you can also right click. If you go into a menu, for example, there's the set origin menu, and I right click any of these. One, you can assign a shortcut, which is great. But you can also add to quick favorites. And in Blender 2.8, they have this. If you hit Q, you can make a list of things, and they're dependent on mode. So there's none in edit mode because I haven't yet because I'm lazy. And I have some in sculpting mode and blah blah blah. So you can just hit Q and it's modal. So I actually have a little quick menu button for this origin to 3D cursor, which is also fine. If I go back to that set origin search, you got origin to 3D cursor. So if I click that, look at that. I have such a habit of doing this, just going to world origin, that I ruined everything that I was doing. Cursor selected, go to object mode, and I'm just going to say origin to 3D cursor. Boop. And it's popped right where that cursor is. I can just then put the world origin, and then I can just go selection to cursor. Boom. And that's how you used to always have to. But what I liked about it is I didn't have to be accurate. I didn't have to snap stuff to a point that I had to point my mouse at. I didn't have to do a lot of things. I could just select a thing, and I can just snap my cursor to it. and I can make another cube right at that point. The other cool thing about the cursor is that, oh, you actually notice I created a cube in edit mode instead of object mode, which meant that it actually just modified the mesh data. So if I, again, make another cube, oh gosh, that's not useful. Make another monkey, and I change that monkey to just gross stuff. And search for ASD. Yep. Boom. There you go. It's actually in the mesh data because I added that cube in edit mode, which is really cool. It's gross. So that's like some of the most useful stuff with the cursor. Another super useful cursor is wherever it is, and this is where I use it in sculpt mode, especially all the time, is I can pop it around and I can set that pivot point menu we actually had one for 3D cursor. So it's like, if I want, I could look at the knee of a character, I could click the knee joint, and I can just rotate objects. I can rotate, I can say, I want that mesh thing here, and I just want to rotate this vert around that point. You have so much freedom. You can select this ring, which in Blender, if you want to select a ring instead of hitting just shift and selecting a bunch of verts all day long, you can, oh gosh, that thing just crashes constantly in this version. If you hold Alt and select basically towards a direction. So if you're in vert mode and you select on an edge, it'll actually select a whole ring. Same thing here. If I select towards this edge, it'll select these two verts, so on and so forth. It'll even do faces that way. So if I select towards this face, boop, so on and so forth. So it's pretty great. You can do that, and you can just say cursor to selected, and you can, put the origin right here if you want to. So that's kind of how you deal with setting origins. And if you were array that we were talking about, which I'm going to just make again because I constantly remake stuff, and why not? It's good to do it. Get that array going, boop, and we're just going to get that offset kind of crazy, and whatever. Forget it. I'm just going to make. By the way, for my users, your locator in Blender is called an empty. For After Effects users, your null is called an empty, and so on and so forth with all those different terminologies. It's all the same. Basically just an empty data block. It's just an object data block with nothing in it except for this thing that says, what do you want to look at it as? How big do you want it to display? It's great. It's non-renderable object. And we're just going to grab that empty. And yeah, it's just a bunch of object data that we want. And you can see I actually still have a 3D cursor on, so it's rotating around the center. But so in this example, like what we talked about, where if I applied this, that's now a mesh, which I can then, you can P, or you can search for separate in the menu here, P, and you can say like loose parts. They all have this origin that I don't want, and that's a bummer. And if I want to give this object basically the same origin, I can't give it the rotation. That's just a bummer. You can't do that without manually rotating it or snapping it around. But you can select this whole element. You can say cursor to selected, and then you can go to object mode. Yeah. So I don't have rotation data. My rotation data is 0, 0, 0, which is not what I want, because I want to have some values, but I at least have an origin in the center. So at least this is the central part, which is useful for a lot of things, whether it's particle systems or rigging or. So yeah, so that's like the basics of a lot of Blender like weirdness, I think. Blender's got a lot of weird stuff, but honestly, it's not that weird when you really dig into it, because like Maya is nodal, and those nodes are essentially a location node. And then it's a rotation node, scale node, and then you've got your mesh node or your camera node, whatever. Honestly, I think even Harmony, Toon Boom Harmony, and a lot of 2D programs that are node-based are similar. You've kind of got like a canvas node or like a world node, and in Blender there's a world node. It's right here, a world data block. And you can basically, it's got its own shader and everything attached to it. So it's still organized the same way. It's just not necessarily obvious. And that might change as they make more node-based stuff. Shaders are node-based, compositing is node-based, but modifiers, I think, will be node-based. but it's still working the same way. And the UI complements it. When you first open it, you're like, I don't get it. I don't know why. Why is this organized this way? Why is some stuff in the object panel and why is some stuff in the mesh panel? Hopefully, you should be able to reverse engineer some of that. Go. So, any questions? No.
Did you, I guess some of the questions I had were more about if you had any really quick tips just to get into the grease pencil too, just because there's a lot of other 2D animators in here too.
Absolutely. And part of the reason I wanted to dig into this part first was mostly because I feel like there's a lot, at least when I started trying to learn, like just sculpt or just whatever, it's easy to get in and then you only know that part, but you don't necessarily know how it's handling all this stuff. So it gets really, it's good to know this stuff because it applies to every part of it. So for a grease pencil, pretty much, honestly, the best thing, and actually we'll open the splash screen, which you can like when you start this up, that new file list of templates is actually right here, and these are default. I think my 2D animation background color is different, but yeah, if you open this up, it's just darker because dark. So what this actually does is all this is a file with a different template. Got 2D animation, a full canvas, which is just a timeline and a giant canvas, basically the same as this without the panels on the side, and different viewport settings. That's actually the default viewport color. I have it darker over here, I guess. Compositor and rendering, stuff like that. But what's great is that automatically comes with the stuff you need to start drawing, which I should actually choose a material that will show up here. Why are you not drawing? Blah, blah, blah. It can't be. 1 second, I'm actually, you know what? I don't know why I'm having issues with this. I'm going to open up a different version of Blender just to keep the ball rolling. The animation. There we go. I don't know what I was doing, but I mess around with so many versions of Blender that I feel like I often break them. It should work right out of the box for everybody else. So anyways, if you up here on the right, you'll know there's that outline I had before to see all of our objects and data types. So in the case here, we've got our collection. We've got another collection called camera, which just has a camera object in it, which if I rotate out, I actually rotate out of the camera, and I can see there's a grid here actually. I'm actually, just for ease of viewing, so everyone, whoops. Just want to make sure everyone can see what I'm seeing. So there's like this grid here, and that's basically the floor that we had before, the axes on it. And there's this camera that's already in here by default. There's also this grease pencil object called stroke for some reason. I don't know why. Probably because it's the alpha version. But this grease pencil object is just like the other objects we had. It's got like, it actually has keyframe data. If I drop this down, it's got two sub-objects, which I'll go over in a minute. But basically, the way that a grease pencil object is organized is it's essentially the same thing. It's a go to object mode. It's just this little object center. Like it's just an empty room with the same thing, location, rotation, and scale. And it has different mode types. It has edit mode like we had before, but it also has a sculpt mode, a draw mode, vertex paint, and weight paint. Pretty much the ones you'll use the most are the top four, especially edit and draw. But once you're in draw mode, you're not going to be messing around. You don't need to worry about all the space like we were with 3D objects because you're not manipulating 3D objects. You are, but you're not dealing with like three-dimensional shapes in the same way. You're dealing with lines that are rendered in 3D space. So it's a little more of a free and open workflow. So here at the bottom, there's this dope sheet, Blender dope sheet here. And there's also this little timeline bar with some of our like auto key settings and just play and stuff. But that also shows a list of objects in the scene that have keyframes that are grease pencil objects. So in this case, there's a thing called stroke, just like this. And there's these two things, lines and fills, which if I have this stroke selected, which I do, I'm actually in draw mode on it. Down here, I have that green data block thing that we're always used to. These are our modifier ones. If I click that, it has all the stuff that's specific to grease pencil objects. And then, of course, you've got materials and how they're specific to grease pencil objects and textures. But here you've got layers. And this object comes with a lines layer and by default. You can make new ones by just hitting these plus buttons. And you can even have multiple grease pencil types in your scene that you can switch between that might have different layers or different versions of something that you can give fake users to and all those things. But so what we'll do is we'll select lines here. And there's also, as much as there's this whole menu for materials here, which it comes with a few simple ones, that you can also access all that stuff up here above, which again, if you don't have this showing, you can right click and say show tool settings. But it should show this. It should show that draw tool. Like if I'm in draw mode, whatever tool you have selected here on the left, it's going to show all the settings that correspond with that tool. Let's see. So anyways, you've got a few things. You've got tool options here. These are presets, which you can also access on the side. This is all stuff that's in this properties panel. It's just easier accessed. But this topmost one is always your tool options. So if you click that, again, it's showing your tool with all its settings. And if you click on it, there's different presets. And they all have an F next to them because they all are part of the startup set of brushes. So they are all given a fake user. And you can customize these and make a copy with this button and do all kinds of stuff. So if I make a copy, it's already given a fake user and I can change the settings. So let's go over like a little bit of a basic Blender grease pencil kind of thing. So if you just start drawing in draw mode, you'll just draw. And grease pencil is really interesting because in many ways it's actually a mesh. It's not quite a mesh, but it kind of is. So if I go to edit mode, like we were doing before, you'll actually notice I'm going to just move across this field. This is actually like a 3D object. These are a bunch of lines. By the way, if you're in Blender and you're rotating and your camera is gross, like you just, oh, what? And you want to rotate around this, if you select an object or a group of vertices, like in edit mode, with A as top, you can hit A to select everything. I have it set to toggle, but you can also, I think it defaults to Alt A to deselect everything. And again, I think it's every time I do that makes sense. If I hit the period on the numpad, it will zoom to it and it'll set that as the rotation, which I actually realized I glossed over. The numpad in Blender is really useful. The 1 key is your front view, the 3 is your side, the 7 is your top, and 9 switches between that one and the opposite. And then 4, 6, 8, and 2 are like just arrows. And then 5 is your ortho. And that kind of seems like a lot of information, but it makes sense because you got your arrows, you got front, left, top, and flip, and then ortho toggle, which is the 5 key, which is also accessible right here. There's also a 0 on the numpad is how you get to and from your camera, which if I zoom out, you can see my camera bounds. You can also click this button right here, but it's just 0 on the numpad. So if I, again, select, I can even select just the stroke, which again, it's an element, just like in, so if you hit L for element, of course I'm not doing it because why is it not doing it? Oh, because I'm in, there's like, grease pencil has 3 selection modes. There's stroke, and then there's this thing called boundary strokes, or which are really kind of weird. I'll have to show that in a minute, but really, I could have swore element worked. Well, anyways, it doesn't matter because this second one, the first one is verts. So if I select it, you can see that it only selects a single vert. And that's actually how this is built up. It's built up as just a bunch of verts that are in a line. And that's exactly how Grease Pencil works. And it's rendered in all views the same thickness. So if I select this, it actually selects a whole stroke that's connected verts, which is nice. So anyway, same thing here. If I want to just look at this one, I can hit period, and you can rotate around that. There's actually a similar thing on the touchpad that's just like this. Instead of period, you can hit /, which what that'll do is if I hit / at the top of my numpad, it does the same thing. Oh wow, it doesn't do it to Grease Pencil. Oh my gosh. I wonder if that's just because I'm in this gross alpha version. Yeah, you know what? I'll show you what that does in object mode. What the heck am I doing, everybody? I must have a keyboard key stuck. If I do the same thing here, yeah, so you'll notice that it actually hides everything except for that object, which is kind of weird. But I messed up that. I should have showed that earlier. Anyway, it doesn't matter. I digress a lot, so I apologize. Constantly digressing. So anyways, yeah, so in edit mode, it's the same thing. You can just select stuff and you can move it around. You can just take this stroke. And if you're on the vert level, so let's look through the camera. We'll just zoom and pan around. Let's pretend this is a 2D table. We're not going to rotate in 3D space. I can actually select a vert in any of these lines. Of course I do something crazy. It's because I'm on a pen tablet and it's finicky. Really? It's this button on the pen tablet pin. Why? Oh my gosh. That should not be a problem. Yeah, there we go. So it's a button on my pen is acting up. Let's see. There's someone asked, can those verts on each Bezier be moved in 3D space from foreground to background? Yes. So that's the thing. That's the thing that's crazy about Grease Pencil is that I can just select this stroke. Let's just select it like we would, like a box selection, right? And I'm just gonna rotate it. Like I'm rotating that thing in 3D space. I'm just gonna look at orthograph view so you can see. Like I'm rotating this in 3D space. I can scale it on the X, the Y, the Z. I can do anything I want. And actually what I was gonna show is like I can actually select a vert. And in Blender, I didn't show this earlier, but there's this thing called soft selection or proportional editing is what Blender, but soft selection, another program. It's up here at the top. You can turn that on. You can also hit O to use it. It works in meshes as well. But basically, what it does is it creates whoops, sorry. When I hit G, I have this little this fall off. So I can hit G and I can actually affect this Grease Pencil stroke on a fall off in any direction. And you can rotate it. You can do like all kinds of crazy stuff. You can even, this is what's really crazy, is every single one of these verts has a thickness value, which is similar to a curved Bezier. So if I'll get to that question in 1 second. If I select this point in mesh editing, there's a thing called move by normal of your selection. So if you select a bunch of faces, you can move them all based off the normal, which the poor man's way of saying an inflate. An inflate is basically just a move by normal. And essentially, it's in Blender, it's always Alt S. It's Alt S, which you can use. You can also, there's other tools. I think this right here, this radius tool, it's just like the fancy GUI version. I mean, a lot of my hotkeys are just stuff on the left. I don't even know why I have this open, but I always have it open because sometimes you forget about a tool that you don't have. What's cool is that works with that soft selection we were just talking about. So if I select with that proportional editing on, I click the vert and I hit Alt S, you actually see like I'm actually doing like, so I can actually say, oh, I want this to thicken, or I want to taper this edge or whatever. You can just do that. You can just get in here and affect just a small selection of verts. So that's a way to do that like by hand. Let's see. There was a question. Can those Beziers have curve modifiers applied to create shapes like pipes? No, you cannot, because they're technically not curves. They're verts in an edge chain. If I actually zoom into them, you'll notice the lines are not perfectly smooth. they're calculated smooth, so that they're smooth from the view that you drew, which is really interesting. And you can subdivide them and smooth them in other ways with the sculpt tools and whatnot. You can also warp them and whatnot, but you can just use curves with grease pencil. You're free to do multiple things, and also curves can be converted to grease pencil and vice versa. So I can maybe even show that if I select this whole stroke, like right here, this one stroke, I can go to stroke, and it's going to be convert, right? Or no, where is it? Grease pencil. Where are you? Of course, it's not in here. Or maybe I have to do it in object mode. Yeah, convert to path or Bezier curve. So yeah, that you can actually, and you can do the same thing backwards. So you can basically get. You notice though, it just created a Bezier curve. It's not rendering the same effect because it's not the same. But you can make a curve and then make it into grease pencil. So it's not NURBS. It's something kind of different. They're verts, which actually means that they calculate super fast in 3D space, which is really cool. So you can just have like tons of ink lines all over the place. And it's also interesting because it leads to really weird workflows. There's like a thing in 3D called vertex painting, which is like a lot of people's kind of cheat to get around doing textures. You can basically give each vertex a color. So the denser the mesh, it's almost like the more pixels that are in that image. And so you can do the same thing with grease pencil. You give each vertex a color value, and you can paint it, which is really cool. And that's gotten really powerful with the next version, which I don't think I changed. Yeah, okay, I'm in the new version, so some stuff might be broken. So anyways, we'll go back into that grease pencil object here and go back to draw mode. And so that's the pencil tool. We'll go through a couple different tools. You can create custom brushes. They're not as so one thing people always go like, oh, how could Photoshop brushes or your whatever brushes in Blender? It's not raster. It is points that are calculating a thing. They do want to make it to where every be assigned a texture, I believe, which is the next goal. So you could get something closer to Photoshop, but it's not the same. It's something very, very different. So they are basically vector, but they're kind of not, because they're not Beziers. They're just verts calculating a color. So it's really weird. And they're verts with a thickness value. So I really love that ink pen rough. It's really so these are just a bunch of just tools you've got. They're pretty great, and some of them have different things and whatnot. So something that's really cool with grease pencil is that I'll go. You've got like different. The layers don't dictate what you can do on them. They can take any pin input, but it's just a way to organize your keyframes and things. And you can have different blending modes like regular, overlay, add, subtract, multiply, divide. And you can use some as masks. So you can actually make like a mask. Watch, I'm not going to be, it's going to turn into me not being able to do it. But you should be able to, of course, I'm not going to be able to figure out how to do it on the fly. Masks. Oh, see. Okay, that makes sense. Okay. I actually don't use a ton of it at the moment, but you could say, I want to use mask and I want to use GP layer as mask. Oh, I mean, I'm going to have to mess with this before I show you guys anything about that. But that's something you can dig into. Blender does have a really great documentation that you can reference. It's so good. Actually, you know what? I don't even have to show you because it's right here. And you go to tutorials, support, user communities, dev up, all this stuff, Python API reference. So if something's not working and you're getting an error, you can actually look up that API and wonder why. But you can actually just go to manual, and that's going to take you right to a bunch of really cool stuff, and you can look up exactly how masks work. Let's see. Let's keep moving here. I'm trying not to lose too much track. So materials. So this is really cool. There's different types of materials you can have. These are just examples. You'll notice that the solid fill is using a different checkbox than these ones. There's stroke and there's fill. The reason why is that you actually have stroke which is what that one's doing. But you also have a fill, which is kind of works like, imagine like a lasso tool. And it's doing exactly what you expect, which is it's just a bunch of verts. It's just a bunch of verts, and it's all it's doing. And you notice that this looks gross here. That's because see, it's doing that thing. That's my stupid pen tablet. Yeah, I need to figure out a way to turn off the middle mouse button. I gotta do that later. Anyways, yeah, notice that this is just an average 2 points. You can. Oh my gosh, I'm gonna scream. I'm not really. I'm a calm person. And you can extrude them, by the way. I just hit the E key, just like I was with a mesh, to extrude a face. You can just extrude points all day long. You can even hit F, which if you hit F, it fills the shape. So you can do like a lot of really crazy stuff with grease pencil. But again, that's an edit mode. You can draw this lasso stuff all day long. You can make this fill not just have a color, but have an alpha. So I can actually say that I want it to be red, but I want to see stuff behind it. I want to layer it up. So you can actually get pretty artistic with just the material tools, which are right here. That's actually going to change in the new version, which I'm running. Next version, which is coming out, I think, next month, you'll be able to use, instead of just materials, vertex colors, which is just pick a color. It's just, you can just use different colors all day long, which is not going to let me because I don't have it set up to render vertex colors at the moment, which is done by default. Again, I could point you towards resources if anyone's curious. So I'm going to keep this on material mode at the moment. So yeah, you've got your fill, you got stroke. You can do both at the same time. And you'll notice that as I update material, it updates everything that's assigned to that material. So if I go into edit mode and I say, oh, actually, I want this here, this group of points to be, oh, L does work as soon as you select one vert. I want this group of points to be a different material. I want it to just be square stroke, which is this other weird material. You can every material has an assign, select, and deselect. So basically, all you're doing is you're saying, hey, these verts, because again, like just like meshes have a material or a group of materials assigned to them, any verts here can be assigned material. So for example, I can say, I want to give you a different material. You hit assign, and it'll take all the selected verts that you have, and it'll give them that material. And I'm going to break this pen. I don't know why it's got such a sticky middle mouse button. Let's see. Someone asked a question. This is going to sound silly, but is there a way to paint bucket tool? Yes, there is. So let's talk about that. Let's go to draw mode. We're just going to do a circle right here. It's a beautiful little circle. There's this little paint bucket right here. It's called fill. And if I take, again, it's material based. So I need a material that is going to be a fill, right? I need it to be a fill. So right now mine are all gross. I'm going to make a new one, call it just material because that's default. And I'm going to turn on fill instead of stroke. I'm going to set this to just like blue. And we're just going to click. And you'll notice it filled it perfectly. And what that did is it essentially assigned, it created verts that are basically hugging these verts that that essentially are showing that color, which is really cool. So it made a second set of verts that are basically tangential to those. And that also does work in 3D space. It's of course, you know, it's going to be rendered stretched across those verts from the side and stuff. But like if I, let me do that again. We'll go to draw mode, go to solid stroke. We're just going to, of course, I'm in fill tool, which you can just, I have my things at the space bar for tools, so I can just hover over these and tap them. So I'm going to draw another circle. But actually this time, what's the, it's from view. Oh, it's actually not, because it's not set that way. Here we go. Up here at the top, there's this origin and front view. This is really cool. You can actually say view instead of front. So it'll be drawn from view. So it's actually like whatever my view was, it draws from there. And what's cool is I can do, I'm actually going to get a little gross. Let's modify this thing. So we're going to hit that proportional editing. And I have a hotkey to, oh gosh, screencast keys. Why are you stinking? Yeah, there we go. So we got this kind of nasty warped 3D shape. And actually, yes, thank you, Zach. I'll do that. I'm glad people are so excited about Grease Pencil. I'm super excited about Grease Pencil. It's great. I use it all the time. All right, so I'm gonna make it so gross. I'm gonna go into draw mode. We're gonna grab a little paint bucket, and I'm gonna do the same thing. I'm gonna grab that blue material, and we're gonna fill it. Oh God, that's because I had a gap. But guess what? There's a really cool thing in this fill tool, which is right here in the tool options, but we don't have to do that because we have this top bar. There's this thing called leak size. So I'm gonna just turn this up to like, I don't know. I don't even know what it wants. Like 7 pixels. Let's click it. Oh God, that's not enough apparently. Let's make it 15. I'm seriously getting this value wrong. There we go. Look at that. Oh, you know why? Because it's like stretch. Oh no, look at that. Oh, it's origin from view. That's weird. I don't know how the fill tool works, apparently. I thought maybe it would work great. Maybe it will. Boundary default. Strokes. See if that changes it. Let's go back to edit mode. We're just gonna... I'll talk about also deleting stuff that's not in edit mode in a minute. I'll put the eraser for those who are still gonna hang around. So we'll try that again. No, why? You know what? I'll eventually find out how this works. I know that I've seen this thing work differently, but again, I think it's is it because I'm from view? It is because I'm from view. I'll bet maybe. I'm curious. I'm just gonna try one more time. I'm just curious what we'll do. No, I'll bet you that it has something with how this tool relates to other things. Boundary strokes, boundary edit lines. Oh God, yeah, something. I'll figure that out today. That is pretty gross. It looks like the fill tool does not like it. However, you can duplicate that stroke and you can add to it. You could also do this. Let's just grab this vert line. I'm just gonna give it that material. We're gonna assign it. And look at that. We have our... I don't know why it was not able to do a fill tool. Maybe it's because I'm in that gross alpha where stuff's broken. So I just changed... Yes, you just suggested the thing that I finally was like, why didn't I just do that? But yeah, you can see you actually create like curved things. And it's pretty nuts. So you can make like rounded balls that you can like move your camera around and actually get like some parallax movement and stuff. So it's pretty cool. I definitely like that. So I'm actually going to start with a fresh grease pencil. Snap. I'm going to make that thing's world origin just to make sure my scene's clean. We're going to add grease pencil, and we're going to add... There's actually some defaults. There's stroke, which is just a stroke that just like, and you can monkey, which is, you know, because you got to have a Suzanne for grease pencil mode. You know, you gotta have it. Why wouldn't you? Oh, I still have proportional editing. And you can see too, like if I edit with soft selection on, it's actually going to move that fill. That's its own layer, its own material, its own everything, which is really cool. And you can even select just. Of course, I'm not even taking my own advice here. Select just front ones. Look at that grossness. Gross. Yeah, you can cast lights onto grease pencil as well. So one thing I was going to mention really fast is there's also you can erase. You grab this erase tool and just come in here and you can erase point. You'll notice it actually fades them. It does kill the fill verts, which is a little weird. That's the thing. It's like if you figure out if you kind of have a workflow that works for this, it'll just work for you pretty well. But you'll notice that like it fades it doesn't delete the vert right off the bat. It kind of fades it. You can change that. There's eraser point, eraser soft, eraser stroke, which is just like die, which is pretty great. So as soon as it touches the verts, it just kills an entire stroke. So it's like a pretty cool way of handling. There's this new tool, which I don't think is in 2.2. It's in the next, called Tint. This is where it starts getting wacky. because it's just vertex painting. So you're just giving each vertex and you can do that in strokes, you can do that in fills, so you can actually create lots of gradients and effects, all kinds of really cool stuff. There's also this other tool I'm going to go over real fast. I'm just going to make this cross section right here. Notice I got these two. Let's say that I wanted this arm. I just don't want these sticking. There's this little tool called the cutter. What that does is it looks at edges perpendicular, and it says, "Oh, you don't want everything on this side of that." Just boop.
Hey, Cory.
Actually, yeah.
I don't want to cut you off in a part where you're like really in the middle of it,
no.
but I don't know if we want to take like a last round of like thank yous or something. Does everybody want to say thank you? You can turn your mics on and thank Cory for the insane amount of knowledge that he just dropped here.
Thank you.
You're the best.
For showing everyone how awesome Blender is.
Yeah, that's like the closest we'll get to applause.
Gotta spread the word of Blender.
Oh, it's all right. I appreciate it. I know I get a little passionate going off tangents.
That was amazing.
So nice because whenever I'm at a Nice Moves event, I always end up talking about how awesome Blender is, and I feel like everyone's just annoyed by me, but I just have to say it.
Yeah.
So you're not alone.
Yeah, you're not alone. You might not have noticed this. I'm like running Linux even. I'm like one of these really hardcore open source people. Yeah, I know. I'm one of those people. But I love it. I love Blender. There's so much more. I could go on and on because it's such a widely useful generalist tool. I did want to get. There's so much more to the grease pencil. I didn't even touch sculpt mode or anything. But I'm glad that people are interested in grease pencil too, because I would like to go more in depth in that if anyone wants to.
Maybe like a future episode.
Yeah, you're
like
right.
Projection painting and talking about like more features that would be more basic for like entry level users that they could then expand upon.
Yeah, maybe a series of specific. This is Mike, by the way. A series of specific things like the grease pencil thing. There's a lot for me because I'm not a 3D guy, so it hurt me a little bit to watch this. But clearly you got a good audience, so that's a good sign. So I think we sort of do this. So thank you for doing it in the first place. But I think I'd like maybe just have these specific things whenever you got one together would be really awesome for people.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I hopefully like specifically some of that 3D stuff we talked about at the beginning with like the UI and how this stuff's like kind of organized. And
that was incredibly helpful because I'm starting to move around more and more into Blender, and just like the way you explained it is a great way to think about it when you're starting to learn how to move around. It's like things you wish you knew before having to go through all the pain of learning it yourself.
That's one of the biggest challenges I had, was that it took so long to get that. It's like people told me what buttons to push, and stuff like that, but they didn't always talk about why I should push that button. Like, what does the software really want? Like, how does Toon Boom Harmony want me to make a keyframe? Not just how do I make a keyframe?
I like the idea of looking at it like there's a technical aspect and there's an organic aspect. When you kind of said like, I don't just move, like, very early on you had mentioned like, I don't just sit here in the viewport and move things on axes all day. But that kind of stuff will help when you try and translate the information to more of an organic workflow that you are talking about right now with the grease pencil. So those technical aspects, like at least for me, are super important, and this is very informative. Like some of it's review, but a lot of it's really cool information to know.
Sure.
Thank you. Oh.
Well, that's awesome. I'm glad to hear that. And for anyone who does start just digging into grease pencil, I hope that also means like if you apply a modifier and it's not the way you wanted it, check your object, make sure it's scaled 1 to 1 1, stuff like that. Like it's a way to, if you know some of those things, I feel like you can troubleshoot when you're like, why isn't this doing the thing I want it to do? You've got that kind of understanding of where some of these numbers could be affecting things. Cool. Well, any other last second questions that don't require too much, or should we just call it?
Everyone can keep chatting in the Blender channel too.
Yeah.
If they want to, if everybody still has questions and stuff. This is like the first one of these, and I cannot believe